Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Tell me exactly what happened.
He was on the log, watching them. Then the water just exploded.
Do you see him now? Is he still visible?
No. Just ripples and red spreading through the swamp.
Headlights pierced the darkness minutes later, emergency vehicles rattling down dirt roads and scattering dust into the humid night. Cypress shadows leaned long and twisted, their gnarled roots rising like skeletal hands from the flooded earth. What had begun as quiet study had become chaos. Onlookers stood in silence, watching a swamp turned crimson, a stillness broken only by distant thunder. The man at the center of it all was Aaron Cole, one of the nation's most respected alligator specialists. For years, he had been the calm voice among chaos, the one who insisted these creatures were more than predators. Yet here, in the same waters he had dedicated his life to, nature had reminded everyone of its unrelenting truth. This is not fiction. These are true stories, told in reverence and warning. Subscribe to Animal Shock Stories and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe drives someone to devote their life to the very force that might one day consume them? Aaron Cole had always been an unlikely kind of hero, the sort who never raised his voice yet carried a weight of presence that made people stop and listen. In the world of alligator specialists, dominated so often by men eager to prove their toughness with swagger and reckless stunts, Aaron was the quiet one, the observer, the patient student of reptilian silence. Colleagues said he had an uncanny way of standing near a creature that could rip him apart in seconds and appearing utterly unafraid, not because he believed himself invincible, but because he respected what lay before him with an almost reverent calm. He listened more than he spoke. One biologist once said, a remark that followed him for years and seemed to encapsulate his life philosophy. Where others lunged with poles or ropes, Aaron simply waited, reading the ripples on the water like lines of poetry, recognizing that even the faintest flick of a scaled tail told a story if you were patient enough to hear it. His reputation grew not from spectacle but from restraint, and soon filmmakers began seeking him out not to capture a man wrestling a beast, but to frame the image of a man standing still as the ancient shadow of a gator slid past his boots. In documentaries, his words were sparse, his sentences clipped, but his eyes always carried depth, as if he was forever holding back the unspoken truth that predators were never truly tamed. Conservation groups called on him when rogue alligators wandered too close to human homes, when a mother protecting her nest threatened boaters, or when a massive bull had to be relocated before violence broke out between species. Every time, Aaron handled it without showmanship, guiding ropes, coaxing movements, ensuring no unnecessary harm came to animal or man. There were rescue missions too, half forgotten in the archives of local news. Aaron wading waist-deep in murky water to free a trapped juvenile tangled in discarded netting. Aaron kneeling in mud with a child beside him, explaining why the animal deserved not fear but distance and respect. Through it all, his humility remained his defining mark. He never accepted the label of expert without hesitation, often repeating, "I'm still learning, always learning." To him, knowledge was never a destination but a constant, uneasy truce between human understanding and nature's secrecy. His colleagues marveled at how the wild seemed to tolerate him, how animals that startled at the presence of others remained still under his gaze. He never bragged, never sold himself as invincible, never sought fame, yet by doing so, he became something rarer, a figure both revered and mourned, a man whose devotion had carved a quiet legacy long before the swamp claimed him. In life, Aaron Cole was a whisper in a world of shouts, and it was that whisper, fragile yet enduring, that drew people to him, believing he might have unlocked a secret to harmony most had only dreamed of. Long before Aaron Cole became a name murmured in conservation circles or a figure preserved in grainy footage of rescue missions, he was a boy wandering barefoot along the edges of Louisiana's swamps, a quiet child who preferred the company of cicadas and herons to the noise of neighborhood games. His earliest memories were not of playgrounds or crowded classrooms, but of water shimmering dark beneath moss-draped cypress trees, of air so heavy with humidity it seemed to press every sound into silence, and of the slow, deliberate movements of creatures most others never wanted to see. He had been only 8 years old the first time he stumbled upon an alligator nest, crouching low in the reeds as he watched the cracked shells tremble with life. One by one, hatchlings pushed through, their small eyes gleaming like black beads as their tiny snouts broke free, chirping with fragile defiance. Where other children might have run in fear or hurled rocks to stir chaos, Aaron sat perfectly still, captivated by the miracle unfolding before him. Later, he told his friends, in the simple certainty only a child can muster, I'm going to protect them. His friends laughed, warning him that gators were dangerous, that no one wanted to be near them. But Aaron's resolve did not waver. That single moment, the chirping of hatchlings against the backdrop of a vast swamp, became his first calling, a memory that would replay in his mind years later as he handled beasts that outweighed him 10 times over. Growing up, his family saw signs of this bond deepening. While others avoided the bogs and marshes, Aaron returned daily, sketching the curve of tails in worn notebooks, memorizing the rhythm of water disturbed by sudden movement, whispering observations into the air as if the swamp itself were listening. He collected no trophies, sought no glory. Instead, he kept feathers, bits of shed skin, and faded maps, treasuring them like relics from a sacred space. Teachers noted his unusual focus, how he'd write essays not about baseball or summer vacations, but about the delicate balance between predator and prey, the way ecosystems thrived only when each creature played its role. To Aaron, alligators were not monsters lurking in shadows, but guardians of a system far older than himself. They were living echoes of an ancient world, carrying secrets written in their armored backs and unblinking stares. This reverence set him apart, quietly shaping the man he would become. Even as others dismissed the creatures as threats, Aaron cultivated in himself a conviction that they deserved understanding, not fear. And so his childhood, framed in the humid glow of Louisiana's swamplands, became less a stage of innocence and more the foundation of a lifelong vow. That he would dedicate himself to the very beings the world recoiled from, choosing empathy over fear, study over conquest, and devotion over dismissal. As Aaron Cole grew into the life he had once promised to the hatchlings of his childhood, his days and nights became an unbroken chain of hours spent in marshlands where few dared linger. His body weathered by sun and rain, his notebooks swollen with damp from the constant press of humidity. He logged thousands of hours sitting on rotting docks or drifting silently in aluminum boats, eyes fixed on the water's surface, waiting for the faintest ripple to betray the presence of an ancient reptile. Danger was never theoretical, it brushed against him constantly in the hiss of sudden movement or the guttural bellow of a territorial bull. There were times when a massive head would rise inches from the boat, jaws yawning wide enough to remind him of mortality, yet he never flinched. His calm was his shield, a stillness that seemed to disarm even the creatures themselves. Those who knew him often spoke of his discipline, but discipline came at a cost. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings because they knew he would be out in the field, tracking movements under a fading sun. Birthdays passed with missed calls, holidays with empty chairs. Relationships wilted under the strain of his singular devotion, partners unable to compete with the pull of the swamp. He never raised his voice in protest, never argued. He simply slipped back into the marsh, as if tethered by something greater than choice. His family worried over the loneliness that clung to him, but Aaron himself carried no resentment, convinced that knowledge demanded sacrifice. For him, the study of alligators was not just biology but an act of faith, a belief that if humans could truly understand the creatures they feared, coexistence might be possible. In his journals, phrases appeared like prayers, bridges, not barriers, respect before control. He wrote of the quiet intelligence in the way a gator angled its body to absorb sunlight, of the careful patience in its stillness. of the fierce devotion of mothers who would fight to the death to protect a nest. Each observation deepened his conviction that these animals were not monsters but teachers, symbols of resilience and balance. Yet in embracing that devotion, Aaron drifted further from the human world, carving a life that belonged more to the swamp than to any community. Nights alone in tented camps, mornings shrouded in mist rising from black water, countless hours lost to silence. It was a rhythm that few could endure. Still, for Aaron, the sacrifice was the proof of his calling. He believed that by bridging the gap between human and predator, he was not only protecting lives, but honoring the fragile thread that bound all beings together. It was a lonely road, but he walked it willingly, every step carrying him deeper into the shadowed heart of the swamp that would one day claim him. On the day that would become his last, Aaron Cole returned to the swamp with the same quiet precision that had defined his entire life. His purpose set on observing a single male gator that had long been spoken of in cautious tones among locals, a massive bull known for his unusual aggression, his size whispered about as if myth and biology had merged. Aaron had tracked him before, studied the broad patterns of his movements, but this time his focus was on behavior, a study meant to capture the shifting dominance hierarchy of the swamp's reptilian kingdom. From the moment he stepped from his truck and felt the humid air press down like a weight on his chest, there was an unfamiliar tension in the atmosphere, something intangible that clung to the senses. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made sweat bead instantly on the brow and turned the air into a living thing, thick and almost suffocating. Insects buzzed in relentless swarms, a high, unceasing whine that filled the silence between his own breaths. Yet beneath their drone lay a deeper stillness, unsettling in its rarity. Normally, the swamp was alive with bird calls, herons, ibises, and red-winged blackbirds lifting their voices into the canopy, but on this day, their absence rang louder than any sound. The cypress trees loomed like watchmen, draped with moss that hung motionless in the heavy air, as if nature itself had paused in anticipation. Aaron, however, did not turn back. He moved deliberately, unloading his gear, setting his boat into the water with practiced efficiency. His journals were stacked neatly in waterproof cases, his camera poised to capture the nuances of a predator's world that most would never witness. He had performed this ritual countless times, his preparation a quiet form of devotion, but there was a gravity in his movements now, as though he too felt the weight of unseen eyes. Locals later recalled that a storm had been forecast, its clouds already bruising the horizon, their edges glowing faintly with the promise of lightning. Thunder murmured at a distance, but Aaron pressed on, calm, methodical, undeterred by omens. For him, the swamp had never been a place of fear, but of communion, its dangers not to be avoided but understood. He pushed off into the still water, the oars cutting smooth ripples across a surface so reflective it mirrored the gathering storm above. The deeper he went, the heavier the silence became, until even the insects seemed subdued, their frantic buzzing softened by the weight of an air thick with expectation. It was a silence that seemed less absence and more warning, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. Yet Aaron, notebook in hand, leaned forward with the same calm curiosity he had always carried, unaware that the very stillness he respected was preparing to break, and that the predator he sought would not remain a subject of study for long. Aaron's preparations in the swamp were as much a ritual as they were a necessity, a sequence of movements refined over decades until they carried the grace of ceremony. He stood at the edge of the water, where his small, flat-bottomed boat waited, its aluminum sides streaked with years of use, every dent and scratch a reminder of past journeys into shadowed waters. Methodically, he laid out his tools. The waterproof notebooks thick with scrawled observations, the camera whose lens bore flecks of dried mud from past expeditions, the measuring poles and field recorder, each piece handled with the reverence of a craftsman touching familiar instruments. To watch him was to witness someone performing more than simple preparation. It was as though each knot he tied, each strap he adjusted, was tethering himself not merely to his equipment, but to memory itself. He tightened ropes with deliberate care, the gesture symbolic, a silent act of binding his life's work to the fragile vessel that carried him into places where few dared follow. His hands moved without hesitation, guided by muscle memory and years of repetition, as if the motions themselves offered protection against the unpredictability of the swamp. The way he checked his camera batteries, cleaned the glass, flipped through the blank pages of a fresh notebook, these were not small tasks but invocations, steps in a private liturgy between man and nature. The heat pressed down heavy as he worked, yet Aaron moved slowly, never rushing, pausing often to let his gaze drift across the still surface of the water as if listening for a response. He adjusted his hat, tightened the straps of his vest, tested the oars with quiet strokes that sent gentle ripples expanding outward, each one swallowed quickly by the swamp's stillness. To others, it might have seemed mundane, even tedious, but to Aaron, it was grounding a way to mark the line between the world of people and the world of predators, a line he crossed only with humility. Every action echoed the truth that had defined his life. Nothing in the swamp could be taken for granted, and respect was paid not in words, but in the discipline of preparation. Even the boat itself seemed to become an extension of his body, a fragile raft of order adrift on waters older than any human memory. The ritual completed, Aaron exhaled slowly and pushed away from the bank, his figure small against the vast sprawl of cypress and moss. The swamp seemed to close around him as if swallowing the last trace of human presence from its edges, leaving only the steady dip of oars and the quiet weight of a man bound not just to his tools, but to the history of every journey that had brought him back to this place, to this moment where ritual met fate. The deeper Aaron drifted into the swamp, the more the water betrayed an unease he could not ignore, though he chose to press on. Normally, the great reptiles lay half submerged, eyes and nostrils breaking the surface like ancient sentinels, their movements deliberate and languid, conserving energy for the hunt. But on this day, the stillness was broken by sudden splashes, broad tails thrashing the shallows with an agitation that sent concentric ripples fanning outward. He paused to record the behavior, his pen scratching quick notes in the waterproof journal balanced across his knee, each entry precise but shadowed by something he did not name. A massive shape circled his boat twice, its eyes glinting above the waterline before sinking silently beneath the surface, leaving behind a froth of disturbed bubbles that seemed to linger too long. A splash in the distance answered with another closer by, as though an unseen communication was weaving through the swamp's murk. At the edge of a nearby dock, a fisherman packing up his nets raised a hand, his face lined with concern. "They're restless today," the man called out, voice low, carrying across the heavy air. Aaron looked up, offered a nod that was both acknowledgement and dismissal, then returned to his work. For him, warnings were not deterrents but data points, signs that required observation, not avoidance. He adjusted the focus on his camera, tracking the arc of a tail as it churned the water, recording the guttural bellow that rose like thunder from the chest of a dominant male. Yet beneath the steady surface of his professionalism, there was a flicker of something else, a recognition, perhaps, that the swamp was no longer merely watching but answering, that the creatures were not passive subjects but participants in a ritual of their own. The cicadas had quieted, the birds still absent, and even the air seemed to throb with an energy that pressed against his skin. The fisherman, now a shadow receding behind him, shook his head and muttered something Aaron could not hear. Devotion, however, carried Aaron forward. He had spent a lifetime convincing others that knowledge bridged fear, that even the most violent predator could be understood through patience. To turn back now, because of splashes and silence, would be to betray the very vow he had lived by. And so he dipped the oars again, propelling himself deeper into the labyrinth of water and roots, his figure dwarfed by trees that leaned close as if to listen. Behind him, the ripples of restless alligators spread outward, each circle folding into the next, until it seemed the entire swamp was stirring, whispering a truth he refused to hear. That devotion, when pressed too far, was indistinguishable from denial. There had been a time, years earlier, when Aaron came as close to death as a man could without being taken, And though he never spoke of it with drama, those who were there remembered every detail. He had been wading waist-deep through a stretch of murky shallows, tracking a particularly territorial male that had been reported harassing boaters near a fishing camp. The day had been clear, the kind of hot Louisiana morning where the water steamed against the skin, and Aaron had moved with his usual calm, pole in one hand, notebook in the other, his focus locked on the faint lines of disturbance curling across the surface. Then, without warning, the swamp erupted. A massive alligator burst from below, jaws opening in a flash of pink and ivory, the sound of bone snapping against bone echoing like a gunshot as they clamped shut inches from his arm. The force of the strike sent a wall of water crashing against him, knocking him backward, his pole spinning out of his grip as mud swallowed him knee-deep. Those who watched from the bank froze in horror, certain they had just witnessed his end. Yet Aaron, scrambling upright, dripping with mud and adrenaline, had only chuckled softly, brushing the water from his eyes as if the encounter were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption. "Close," he admitted quietly, but no louder than if he were noting the weather. His companions tried to laugh with him, though one later swore that when Aaron turned away, his expression changed, his eyes carrying a shadow that laughter could not erase. That look haunted them long after, a silent acknowledgement that no amount of skill or calm could alter the truth. One slip, one heartbeat's delay, and instinct would always win. For Aaron, the memory became something folded inward, a scar not on the skin but beneath it, hidden in the quiet moments when his gaze lingered too long on the water. He never allowed the story to grow into legend, never used it as a tale of triumph, but in the rare pauses of conversation, his silence on the subject was louder than words. Now, as his boat drifted through the swamp on this final day, the air heavy with storm and the water alive with agitation, the memory of that near miss seemed to press invisibly against the present. The circles widening around his boat mirrored those ripples from years ago, a rhythm repeating itself with an intensity that suggested nature had not forgotten. The past and present blurred together, warning layered over warning, but Aaron, bound by devotion and belief, pressed forward once more, as though convinced that this time patience would be enough to quiet the hunger that had nearly claimed him before. The final hour of Aaron Cole's life unfolded with a deceptive calm, the kind that made every detail seem ordinary, even as it carried the weight of inevitability. He maneuvered his small boat deeper into the maze of black water and moss-draped cypress, the oars dipping rhythmically, their sound lost beneath the swamp's heavy silence. His camera rested beside him, lenses fogged faintly by the humidity, while his waterproof notebook lay open, its pages smudged with the hurried notes of a man who refused to waste a moment. Every few minutes, he clicked on the small handheld recorder clipped to his vest, his voice steady, clinical, documenting the aggression he had observed. Yet there was something beneath the surface of his words, a fatigue edging his tone, the sound of a man carrying both experience and the quiet weight of premonition, dominant male circling, aggression heightened. Note, frequency of tail strikes. His words broke the stillness like faint echoes against the encroaching storm, but no one would hear them until later, when the recorder was salvaged from the mud. Overhead, the sky had shifted from a pale gray to the bruised darkness of an approaching front, the clouds thickening into layered masses that swallowed the horizon. Flashes of heat lightning flickered silently in the distance, the brief illuminations staining the water with reflections of white fire, as though the swamp itself were lit from within. The air grew heavy, almost electric, clinging to his skin until each breath felt labored, the kind of pressure that animals sense long before humans do. Aaron scribbled one last line, noting the absence of birds, the way the gators seemed to mirror one another's movements, as if joined by a hidden signal. His boat drifted toward a stand of cypress knees jutting from the water like the bones of a drowned cathedral, the place where the massive bull he sought had been seen before. He paused, resting the oars across his lap, and looked out over the surface of the swamp, glassy now, betraying nothing of what moved beneath. For a moment, he simply listened, the stillness pressing so deeply into him it seemed to slow his own heartbeat. In that silence, even the insects faltered, their buzzing replaced by the low rumble of thunder rolling ever closer. He clicked on the recorder once more, his voice softer this time, almost reflective. Unusual tension in the water, possible territorial trigger, proceeding with caution. The words would later feel like prophecy, a final note written not just for science but for remembrance. Above him, the storm gathered its strength, and below, in the black depths of the swamp, something vast waited, patient and unseen, as Aaron, devoted and unwary, drifted closer to the edge of instinct's breaking point. Aaron steadied his boat against the roots of a sprawling cypress, its knees jutting upward like jagged fingers, and with the same unhurried confidence he had carried all his life, he shifted his weight onto a half-submerged log. The wood was slick beneath his boots, water lapping gently against its surface, but he moved with the ease of practice, his balance born from countless such crossings. He lifted his camera, adjusted the lens, and peered across the widening stretch of swamp where the silence had grown so complete it pressed against his ears. For a moment nothing stirred, the water flat as polished glass, and then subtle at first a ripple arced outward, spreading in concentric circles that disturbed the mirror-like stillness. He paused, lowering his pen from the notebook he had been writing in, eyes narrowing with a scientist's curiosity, not fear. The shape beneath the surface was enormous, its bulk moving with a deliberate slowness that made the water tremble, as though acknowledging the weight it carried. Aaron leaned forward, instinctively bracing himself against the log, his camera shutter clicking once, the sound faint against the swelling quiet. To the untrained eye, it might have been nothing more than a passing shadow, but to Aaron it was unmistakable, the sheer mass of a dominant bull, sliding closer with the inevitability of a tide. The image was cinematic, haunting, a shadow rising under glass, a form so vast and ancient that it seemed less an animal than a fragment of prehistory alive again. The surface bulged faintly, then smoothed, as though the swamp itself were holding its breath. Aaron exhaled softly, muttering a note into his recorder, his voice calm but edged with that same fatigue, describing the slow approach, the deliberate circling, the kind of measured movement that spoke not of curiosity, but of intent. A gust of wind rattled the moss overhead, and in that fleeting sound, Aaron adjusted his footing, camera raised once more. He did not retreat, did not shift back toward the safety of his boat. Instead, he leaned further over the log, committed to observation, to capturing a final image of a creature he believed could be understood if only studied deeply enough. In that moment, his devotion carried him into stillness, even as the swamp beneath him stirred with a darker rhythm, the water swelling faintly where instinct prepared to break the surface. The swamp erupted in an instant, shattering the fragile stillness that had cloaked it for hours. One heartbeat, Aaron was leaning over the log, his camera lens glinting faintly in the dim light, and the next, the water detonated upward. A violent surge of spray and foam as the massive bull broke the surface with prehistoric fury. The jaws clamped down with a sound that echoed across the trees, a brutal, cracking thunder that seemed to tear through bone and silence alike, and Aaron was wrenched from his footing, his body swallowed by the chaos of water and muscle. His boat lurched violently, tipping on its side before capsizing, the notebooks and cameras he had so carefully prepared scattering across the surface, spinning briefly before vanishing into the murk. The air filled with fragments of sound, the guttural bellow of the alligator, the frantic splashes of limbs striking water, and a single desperate gasp that cut short as Aaron was dragged beneath. The swamp boiled with violence, cypress knees splashed with spray as if the trees themselves recoiled from what they witnessed. In seconds, the surface calmed again, broken only by widening circles and the faint gleam of bubbles rising from below. His recorder floated briefly, red light still blinking, before it too slipped under. The entire scene was less a struggle and more a revelation, a reminder that control had always been an illusion, that Aaron's years of patience and devotion were no match for instinct unleashed. It was ancient power tearing through human illusion, raw and unanswerable, a force so absolute that it seemed to strip the swamp of sound, leaving only silence in its wake. The log where he had stood moments before rocked gently, the last trace of his presence marked not by his body, but by the rippling void he left behind, a void that seemed to swallow even the storm as thunder rolled unanswered overhead. Hours later, when rescue crews arrived with spotlights cutting pale beams across the water, the swamp greeted them not with struggle or sound, but with a silence so deep it seemed almost reverent. They found fragments scattered along the edges of the reeds, shredded pages from waterproof notebooks swollen with mud, the broken frame of a camera lens glinting faintly beneath the surface, the overturned boat lodged against a cypress root, as though nature itself had claimed it. There was no trace of Aaron Cole, no body to carry back to his family, only the remnants of a life spent in devotion to creatures that had never promised safety in return. The swamp, eerily calm, appeared as it always had, water smoothing itself into glass, moss swaying softly with the evening breeze, the heavy air still carrying the smell of rain. To those who gathered on the banks, Aaron was remembered not as a man who underestimated danger, but as one who believed, perhaps too deeply, that knowledge could bridge the gulf between human fear and predator instinct. His colleagues would speak of his patience, his humility, the countless rescues and conservation efforts that bore his name. Yet in the end, the lesson lay not in what he achieved, but in the truth of what claimed him, that no matter how much we study or how deeply we devote ourselves, there are forces older than our understanding, bound not by respect but by survival. The swamp bore no malice, no memory, no grief. It simply absorbed him as it had absorbed countless others, indifferent and eternal. And so his story closes with a line that lingers like a shadow in the mind. But the swamp does not remember devotion, it only remembers hunger.